Good morning. It's our privilege this morning to have with us John and Emily Hansen as we conclude this second go-around in this series called Stories from the Fold. As you know, this is a time that that's really grown out of our values as a church. Our values, our core values, are really rooted in the authority of Scripture. That brings us to the place where we recognize that we're all personally responsible with our own growth and relationship in Christ, but also moves toward that place of genuine relationships. And we recognize that genuine relationships takes transparency in our lives. And I think this is a series that we're learning to celebrate here at Northside as we become a people who are really open books that allow people to see the glory of God and His gospel in the context of our lives. And John and Emily are here this morning to do just exactly that. So welcome, guys, and thanks for being willing to do this. Just real briefly, would you just describe for us your individual spiritual journeys up to the point that you met and married a few years ago?
For me, I was raised Baptist in Georgia. I grew up going to Vacation Bible School. I was involved in prayer teams at our high school. We did prayer at the flagpole in the morning. I was saved when I was about 10, baptized when I was 13. So pretty regular church attender, but what I would now call a congregational Christian.
So what does that mean, just real briefly? Emily, what do you mean by congregational Christian?
Basically, I went to church. I understood who I thought God was at that time in my life, but I didn't have what I would call now a ongoing relationship with Him.
Okay. And that continued up until you and John met and married?
Yes.
John, your background?
Also raised Baptist. Our family went pretty regularly till I was like 10 or 12. For me, it was just a fun time. I had Vacation Bible Schools and Sunday school, and I didn't really have so much of a relationship as I was going because I was supposed to. I was dedicated in the church, but never baptized. And basically from about the age of 12, I really didn't have much of a relationship. I just kind of wandered until my brother kind of helped bring me back into the fold a little bit, and I set myself on a path with Christ. I made a decision and kind of re-engaged that relationship, but that still at that point wasn't really, there wasn't much stuff behind that.
Okay.
You know, I wasn't even a congregational Christian. I was a Christian if you asked me. You know,
So you were a Christian in name only at that
pretty
point,
much,
right?
yeah. I wasn't living the appropriate lifestyle or even attempting to, you know. I was a, foxhole Christian.
Okay.
And and that continued predominantly until we were married and in the service, and Emily kind of helped drag me back a little bit.
Okay. So you guys meet and marry, you're working through some things, and like most couples do, get some lofty goals set. You want to live the American dream, right? Describe for me a little bit some of the challenges and conflicts that you guys face once you're married, your husband and wife, and you're on this journey to build this life that we're always looking for.
I would say challenge number one would be the Army. Just figuring out how to live with another person,
Yeah.
normal life stuff.
So you learn to manage that
Mm-hmm.
through that. Hopefully your relationship's growing. Right?
Yep.
So as things progress, John, I think you go overseas for a while. You spend some time in Iraq.
That's correct. Yep.
And back home, and so you guys start building a home, a family.
Yep. So that's basically where we quit reacting to life, and we decided to set some goals. We decided that we wanted to have a child, but I wanted to be practical, and I was like, I'd like to get a promotion or two before that happened, and
I wanted to finish school.
Yeah.
Yep. And she wanted to finish school, and so we said one or the other. If whichever one or the other happens first, then at least I wanted her to have her degree. I didn't want her following me around in the service and never have anything to show for herself. And I wanted but I obviously wanted to tend to my career, and we both wanted a child. So we're like, if one or the other happens, then that'd be great. But this was our path that these were our most important things to us.
Okay.
Nothing else.
Okay.
No,
So you start hitting these goals and things start going well, even to the point that you get the news you're pregnant.
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah.
Everything came together perfectly. I got promoted, and
Yep. I graduated, got pregnant, had a baby.
Okay. So describe that period of time for us.
Pretty exciting. I mean, it was, we knew by that time we were going to have a daughter. My entire chain of command was excited for me. They were supportive. I'd been with them for a while. They knew that we'd had goals. My closest mentors, and her family was close and supportive, and everything was just a roller coaster. Yeah, it was like falling in place. At that point we were like, man, we got to set some new goals. And in a period though of just a short period, it all just blew apart.
So describe for us briefly what happened.
Basically, I was pregnant. 40 weeks, I was full term, and they decided to go ahead and induce me because I was full term. Everything was normal, healthy pregnancy, no issues. So we went to the hospital to start the inducement. Basically, I was in labor for approximately 30 hours. And throughout that process, still normal delivery or labor and everything. And when it came time to push, everything was good to go. He was a nurse at the time, so he was going to help deliver her. And when she was born, the cord was wrapped around her throat twice, and there was also meconium in the womb that we were not aware of during the entire labor. So very quickly things went bad. Basically at that point they started working on her and immediately took her from the room. We were at a hospital that did not have a NICU, and basically they had what they called a critical care nursery, which is pretty much a regular nursery. And so from that point on, everything happened really rapidly. He could probably tell you better from there. I was in a fog a little bit.
No, it was just one of those things. I think in the military, various jobs within the military, you train to a certain level of a common storm or proficiency, red line, to be able to operate. And this just happened to become one of those moments for me where I saw what was happening in my limited training and knew the seriousness of it, and everything just slowed down. And I went into damage control, and basically I pretty much knew how bad it was from the time that I called Abigail. I knew the risk, and within about 5 minutes I knew that the chances of her making it were very slim. And so from that point on, it became, my job was to, in my mind, was to keep her calm. So that everyone else, we wouldn't be a factor to distract anybody. And I left with Abigail. We got her transported to another hospital that had more appropriate facilities. 24 hours later, me and the doctor taking turns, we kept Abigail basically alive. He obviously was the subject matter expert, but it was literally, we motivated Abigail to stay alive in our selfishness, basically.
Until I could get there,
yeah.
Pretty much. We were waiting for the hospital to release me, and they wouldn't, so I had to be transferred so that I could be there. Because at that point, I had basically only seen her for just a moment. I never got to hold her, anything to that point, so they were doing everything they could until I could get there.
And so that, basically Emily arrives at the second hospital, and it wasn't, I didn't even give her a chance to sit down. It was that precarious that she came in, she was talking with her brother, and it was very difficult. You could see that she was struggling, not in the sense of struggling, she didn't have a clue how bad, and I wasn't conveying that, nor was I going to at that point, but we we got her. She didn't get a chance to sit down in the bed. She had to come back, and it was shortly thereafter that we got to say goodbye to Abigail.
So, leave the hospital. Life is upside down. What do you do with that? What's life like for the next couple of years?
For me, it was scary. It was very scary. It pretty much just shook me to the core. Everything that I believed or thought I knew about life, God, the world in general, didn't seem to be true anymore. And it was a very scary place.
Yeah, it always amazed me in our relationship. I've always had what I consider a realistic view of the world and the people that walk around in it, good or bad people. And some folks amaze me, with how they walk around and they don't see these things that I see and that other people like me probably see. And I always used to tell Emily, you need to become more aware. You need to be aware that there are bad things in the world, et cetera, et cetera. But after that event, that was the one time where I wish I could have recanted every time I'd ever said that I could have made that not the reality.
I think you said in our interview time for your promotional video, you got to the place where you just felt like you wanted to burn it all down.
Absolutely.
So 2 years of this,
Yeah.
right? Just isolated. How are you responding at this point, spiritually? Obviously, emotionally, you're struggling.
I think we weren't at all. The Army chaplain came in and talked to us several times, but I think immediately I was so hurt, and he was, I think, pretty angry that we weren't very responsive to anything spiritual at that point. And once I got through some of the hurt, then I got pretty angry, and I didn't know what to do with that. And everybody's like, oh, God's big enough to handle your anger, and, but that's not really helpful. So.
While it's true, it is often not helpful.
It's hard to see it. It's hard to see it when you're in it. It's for us. We weren't trying to survive. We were just going to basically allowing to let happen what happened. But she was angry. She eventually came out of that like darkness, and she was angry. And I had stayed in damage control mode from the time I left the hospital, and that's what I did. I focused and I stayed in damage control mode, and I thought I was had everything shut off, which I think I did pretty well for a while. Chain of command watched me pretty closely. I didn't get to my next deployment. They wanted me to stay with her, and so I just stayed at home, and I slowly imploded is what I was doing. So she was getting angry, and I was getting angry, but I didn't know what to be angry at. That's where my relationship, I think, in a way, I talked more to God in those 2 years than I probably did in my entire life. And it wasn't great conversations. It was not great conversations.
So in the midst of all of this, you're questioning what you believe, wrestling with God. What examples of God's unconditional love, His acceptance, His grace, what examples of the gospel do you begin to see in that period of time after getting through it?
I think the biggest example for me was the people that surrounded us. We got letters, phone calls from people who we'd never even met, never heard of. They were a friend of a friend or a distant relative. Nurses from our hospital sent books and letters, and people just showed up. They prayed for us, and they fed us.
Yeah, it was, for me, it was a little bit further. I was so cut off from everybody and everything, I couldn't see much of the good that she's talking about. I didn't care. I thought it was platitudes, fakeness. or shallow. You know, that's how bitter. That's really what I thought. You know, once or twice it got through to me. I think one day we were so depressed that we sat on the couches and literally like hadn't spoken to each other in days. And we heard like a scrape at the front door, and it was like some chicken and rice that somebody had brought by, and it was just perfect. You know, just like one of those rare moments that it broke through. For me, it took a while longer. It came, for me, I got to see the beginnings of what God could be in my life when I quit trying to make a plan. When I finally I hit such a point of despair, I said, I don't care. I don't care. I actually ended up in a position that I was advised to not ever end up in, all right, within my service. And it was actually exactly where I needed to be. You know, considered one of the more stressful positions within the military, and it's been the best 2.5 years of our marriage probably. It was, as soon as I quit trying to just force everything to my will, and I was able to just let be what was going to let be, and accept, most importantly, what was going to be, it was right.
So at the end of that time, some things began to change in terms of your assignments, your orders.
We
Yeah.
were supposed to go to Germany. We had orders to go. We were packing our things and getting very excited, and thought this was a step forward, a way out of where we were. And then that fell through, and
Bureaucracy.
we were not very
Plain and simple, it was
excited.
bureaucracy. Yeah, so.
And then he was told, you're going to go do this assignment, which is the one he was talking about,
Yeah.
the one here. And
The previous assignment, just to be clear, that was my push, that was my plan. It sounded like a great plan, put me closer to family than even being here in the States. Gave us a chance to start fresh, new command, new geographical, new everything. I just had the best idea ever, you know, and yeah. And it literally got torn down around my ears in a matter of 60 days.
yeah.
I didn't realize that. That explains a lot now. I think I've mentioned to you the first time I saw you guys show up here at Northside.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I could tell Emily was hopefully expectant, 7 months pregnant, and you just looked plain mad.
Yeah. It's pretty standard.
Yeah. So God changes some things big time in your life, even with the orders. You're headed to Europe. He redirects you
To
to
here.
Vancouver.
Yep.
So in the midst of all of this, what does God do in your lives once you arrive in Vancouver, and what do you begin to learn about Him and about yourselves?
For me, it's really all been about acceptance. That if I trust, and that's always been my biggest issue in every relationship, not just God, but that if I trust that it's going to be exactly how it's supposed to be, and as crazy as that sounds to me, even saying those words right now, that most of the time I actually will not be angry, that it'll work out just fine. It's when I start influencing events or thinking that I know better, that I can do better, that I typically break stuff, because I just don't have a great track record with that apparently. And how He's presented Himself is that by showing me again and again and again throughout my time here, that if I just stop and I just focus on Him, which is literally can be as simple as dedicating in that moment of stress to pray or to just be silent, to shut my brain off and just to listen, that typically whatever I was about to do will probably not happen, hopefully, and an alternative will occur, whatever that is. And it never seems like the right thing until it is, until looking back, that hindsight, and that's what this whole journey has been these last 2.5 years for us. We came out of that dark time. We got pregnant again. We had a healthy pregnancy. We had a healthy son born. It was a little scary at one moment, but it kind of was about to do the same thing again. But for the most part, we got to raise him, which was important, nice or different. We didn't raise him on a military installation the first 3 years. He was in the civilian world. But he, in one of the greatest areas, I think, is being the Northwest, and he got a different experience, and so he'll have his own kind of personality. Everything, just little things that I never thought were important or significant, are, and it just seems right. I mean, that's the best way I can describe it, is that it feels right. And so going into...
And not our plan at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Literally, like even the position, I was told the position I'd be in, that I would work insane hours, that the divorce rate was high. There have been, even darker issues, and there's been some stressful times, sure, but I'm home typically 9 to 5, or I'm at work 9 to 5. I'm typically home unless it's something special. Even if I do have a crazy week, I have predictability. My leadership allows me to plan and be responsible for those plans and be accountable. So for all intents and purposes, it has been the exact opposite of what everyone told me it was going to be.
The great reversal.
Yeah.
Emily, what have you come to know about God, yourself, others through this?
It's been a crazy transition for me. It really has. I kind of, like I said, started out as the congregational Christian. Didn't really have that relationship or really even know what that would be like. Never even occurred to me. But now it's different. I took a couple classes, took one with you here. We read the book with, and that kind of was a jumping off point for me, just to re-examine what is God in my life now? What does that mean for me? What does that look like? Who is He? Now, what I didn't know before, is it's to me it's a relationship just like mine and His. It's an actual relationship that I have to work at, that I have to work towards. He's not this being in the sky that if we make the right choice, we do the right thing, we help our neighbors, He's going to grant good blessings on us and all will be right in the world. That's not the way it works. It sounds good, but it doesn't work that way. And I think I just had to learn, the same as him, to trust that what is happening in my life is right. It's not my plan, but it is a plan. It's His plan. And the question it came down to, and I think I told you this, is somebody asked me, if you never have another child, if your marriage falls apart during this, which is very common, is God enough for you? If you can't get pregnant, you don't have another kid, it never works out, is that enough? And for a long time I didn't answer that question. But I think I'm in a place now where it is. It's enough. I know He is enough, and I can survive, I can make it, and I can trust in His plan.
For me, it's, I don't know if I'm there yet, but for me, it's still leaps and bounds. My whole life, I believed in God, and this is what I was talking about with that one sermon you had where you talk about congregational versus, faithful. And I've heard the word faith and faithfulness, etc. And it came down to trust. Is absolutely what it came down to. I believe. I just want to do it my own way, though. Because if I do it my way, then I'm responsible. I'm accountable. No one else can be blamed. It's all squared away. And the reality is that as I've learned and practiced to just let go more, I have these moments of peace. And in those moments of peace, there's a peace that I could never manufacture on my own. I know in those moments, that is how my relationship changes. That is me sitting with my God in that moment, because that's what I need. I can manufacture anger, anxiety, stress at the drop of a hat. I can't manufacture that kind of peace within myself. And that's when I know that I'm trusting, and that's when I know it's going to be okay. And they are not always there, because I'm typically in the way of that process. But when I can get there, it's... if I can just open myself up, then I can trust and progress.
You guys, it's been such a privilege to take this part of the journey with you. The future with your relationship to the military, we realize at some point this journey may go a couple ways. After we talked earlier this week, I mentioned to my wife, this is oftentimes the most difficult part of our job is to spend this time together and at times have to say goodbye to each other. We're certainly not going to borrow that trouble from tomorrow here today, but I'll tell you, if it was to change tomorrow. And I think this is the kind of church we're becoming. We're all becoming able to say that our lives are better for being honest, transparent, sometimes painfully open about our doubts and concerns and our trouble and our trials. And I know I express it for everyone else here. I'm just grateful grateful for your courage, your faith, grateful for who you are in Christ. Thank you. Would you join me in thanking I guess I want to just ask you to pardon me in advance. It just seems like this morning there are a lot of things converging. The stories that we've told and shared with each other, some incredible things that God is doing in our lives as He calls us to trust Him and to follow Him. I hope you can appreciate the significance of the time that we're in as a body and what God is doing in our lives. Through this series especially, this time I realized that there is such a contrast between who we are and oftentimes what the rest of the world perceives us to be. Gabe Lyons and David Kinnaman wrote a book several years ago entitled Unchristian. And in that book, through some vast and varied research, they actually developed a portrait, a profile of the perspective of the rest of the world toward the church, toward Christians like us, like you guys. And this is what they discovered, that most people looking in at the church from the outside believe that we're hypocritical, too focused on conversion, anti-homosexual, sheltered, too political, and by and far way too judgmental. But you know what I've realized is that they just don't know us. They don't know us, but I think there's a good reason for that. I'm pretty certain we really don't know ourselves too well. And I think it's because of what we've seen illustrated here in a couple of these series where we have shared life. We don't know each other so well because we don't share ourselves very well. And I think there's good reason for that. We tend to be pretty shallow, keep life on the surface because by and large, we don't want to be real open. We don't want to be real authentic. Because what we want is good stuff, right? I mean, we want to be the picture of success. We want to be the stuff that the rest of the world envies. We want to be those with status and success and power and influence from a good perspective. We want good stuff. We want to look good. Because in the end, we think it's the picture of prosperity that draw people to us and to our testimony of faith in Christ. And we're not alone. I want to encourage you this morning, if you wrestle with that, you're in good company. Because Christians for thousands of years have wrestled with the same thing. In fact, a man who is described in the Old Testament as a man after God's own heart wrestled with the same things. In fact, Psalm 30 is a psalm of that man, King David. And in the beginning of the psalm, he is exalting God, he is praising God, he is thanking God, and you see why in verse 6. He says, "As for me, I said in my prosperity," I said when I was enjoying all those good things, I said when I was that picture of success, "I shall never be moved." I'm the man. I mean, I'm what everybody wants to be. And yet, it was even in a sense, David knew that that was coming out of his relationship with God. You see at the beginning of verse 7, by your favor, O Lord, you made my mountain strong. I mean, in my prosperity, I won't be moved. And Lord, it's all because of the blessings you've bestowed upon me. How many times have we prayed that? How many times have we confessed that? And yet, in the middle of verse 7, life falls apart. You hid your face. It's a description of the sense of the absence of the presence of God. His favor's gone. It's the sense of not knowing where God's at, what he's doing. I mean, life is crumbling. I was dismayed. It's interesting, this word dismayed. It's the same word that's used to describe Saul's reaction in 1 Samuel when he goes to a witch to consult spirits and he gets the prophet Samuel and realizes he's face to face with God. Uh-oh. David says, you hid your face, my life fell apart, I'm in trouble. He was in some tough situations. Question is, what good can God possibly bring into our trials and losses? What good can God bring into our lives in such a way that it begins to shape a life that begins to reveal the true goodness of God, that begins to make us the kind of people who are not willing to just live on the surface, but to open up and begin to share real life? What good can God possibly bring through the stuff that we want to hide in our lives? Two things I want to talk about this morning. The pain that awakens desire, and the provision that fulfills it. You see, nothing exposes the myth of self-sufficiency like pain and suffering in your life. I mean, nothing brings you to the end of yourself than when you experience the collapse of life itself. Although we don't learn anything about this psalm, in this psalm, about David's situation, what we do know is that he likened it to death in a figurative sense. Read with me verses 8 through 12. He says, to you, O Lord, I cry, and to the Lord I plead for mercy. What profit is there in my death? If I go down to the pit, will the dust praise you? Will it tell of your faithfulness? Hear, O Lord, and be merciful to me. O Lord, be my helper. You've turned from me my mourning into dancing. You've loosed my sackcloth and clothed me with gladness, that my glory may sing your praise and not be silent. O Lord, my God, I'll give thanks to you forever. In the first part of this passage, David in verse 9 says, what profit is there in my death? Now, don't miss the significance of this. He's talking about this trial, this trouble he's facing in life, and he's saying, it feels like I am dying here. My end is coming. But then he begins to argue with the Lord. What good does that do for you? I mean, can I praise you from the abode of the dead where everything is silent? If you silence my voice, will that bring you glory? You can almost seem logically beginning to argue with God. Have you ever been there? Have you ever bargained with God? I grew up bargaining with God. I had a knowledge of God. I remember through my teenage years, my young adult years, it seemed like every time anything went south, I was back at the car lot with God. If you do this, I'll do that. And it's amazing what's going on inside of us. Even when you're denying God, you want to know God. It's so messed up, right? And you almost see this going on in David's life. What good is it if I die? Will the dust praise you? Will it tell of your faithfulness? But notice what this description's sandwiched between. It's sandwiched between two pleas for God's mercy. Verse 8, to you, O Lord, I cry. He wasn't crying to anyone else. He was crying out to the true and living God. To the Lord, I'm pleading with mercy. In verse 10, in the original language, this is almost staccato-like. I mean, it's coming to a crescendo, right? David's beginning to scream at the top of his lungs. Right? Hear me, God. Be merciful to me. Be my helper. If I were to paraphrase that, he'd basically say, listen. Be merciful. I want you. I need you. See, nothing exposes the myth of how self-sufficient we think we are like pain and suffering. Didn't you hear it in John and Emily's story? On top of the world. In pain and suffering, you realize just how helpless we really are. And yet it's in that time, and in and through those times, that God awakens desire, true desire. And you see it in what David says in verse 10. Lord, be my helper. Lord, I need you. Because true human desire is not necessarily relief from the pain, but redemption of the pain. Now, I wrestled with this last week. Because most of the time in my life, I spend asking God for relief from pain. But if I'm really honest with myself, I realize that life brings pain. We're not going to escape that, sorry. It's a result of the fall. It's sin itself, right? There's going to be pain in life. And as much as we seek escape from the pain, I think really what God has wired us with by making us image bearers is redemption of the pain. In other words, making it count. And I think I make the theological argument. I just point to Jesus, right? Jesus in the Passion. Jesus in the crucifixion. You go to Matthew 26:39. He's in the garden, right? He takes the disciples with him. He knows he's going to the cross. Jesus goes in. He's suffering. Right? The gospel writers tell us he's sweating blood. That's stress. That's pain. That's turmoil. What does he pray? He prays for relief. Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. If it's possible, you take me out of this. But instead, what does he do? He says, but Father, not my will, but yours be done. I would really love relief from this suffering. But if that's not possible, redeem it. Make it matter. You know, I think that's what the writer of Hebrews tells us in Hebrews chapter 12. Talking about that cloud of witnesses, all those who have trusted Jesus, all those who have gone through pain and suffering, who've had their self-sufficiency exposed, who have had their true human desire realized, not in that they were relieved from their pain, but that their pain ultimately meant much more for the glory of God through it. Fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him scorned the shame of the cross. Right? Consider him who endured such pain, so that you don't become weary in your pain and suffering. You see, the pain of trial and loss in our lives, although none of us want to welcome it, we recognize that God uses it, and that even our pain and suffering does not escape the power of the gospel in our lives. The pain of trial and tragedy is not something to be hidden in our lives, and yet that's what we want to do because we're afraid that's not what anybody else wants to see. It really detracts away from my own self-sufficiency of who I am. I think that's what David learned in my prosperity. I said, I shall not be moved. And yet he opens up his heart as he realizes through that process that it's really God in the midst of his life that makes his life meaningful. So the pain of trial and tragedy is not to be hidden. It's not to be buried under layers and layers of emotional makeup. Right? Isn't that what we do? We trowel on the foundation and spruce it up with a little rouge and put some lipstick on it and We deny that we ever hurt, suffer, or struggle. Look at me. Aren't I just a great person because of who I am? Because of how I've handled this? When what God wants us to do is to bring that pain and suffering to Him, expose it to His light, let Him heal us from the inside out. You know, the interesting thing is it'll always leave a scar. But the scars are so much more beautiful because they point to the heart. And that's what God is doing in Awakening Desire. He's creating people with hearts for Him, hearts that display a love for a lost and dying world. John Piper said, we need coronary Christians, not adrenal Christians. We need Christians with heart. He says, and I quote, not that adrenaline is bad. It gets me through a lot of Sundays, but it lets you down on Mondays. The heart is another kind of friend. It just keeps on serving. Through good days and bad days, happy and sad, high and low, appreciated and unappreciated, it never lets me down. It never says, I don't like your attitude, Piper. I'm taking a day off. No, it just keeps humbly love-dubbing along. Coronary Christians are like the heart in the causes they serve, he writes. Adrenal Christians are like adrenaline, a spurt of energy and then fatigue. What we need in the cause of Christ are coronary Christians. Marathoners, not sprinters. People who find the pace to finish the race. Unquote. We need Christians who have been through pain and trial and loss and experienced the good that God brings into it, and have had once and for all their desire awakened. Awakened for the God who is their strength. Because He's the provision that fulfills it. He's the provision that fulfills our ultimate desire for the redemption of our pain and suffering. You see, no one redeems pain and suffering in life like Jesus. No one. David says, you've turned for me my mourning into dancing in verse 11. You've loosed my sackcloth and clothed me with gladness. You have brought this great reversal in my life. When everything was going crazy, when everything was melting down, when everything was crumbling, when I was so dismayed, you turned it around. It wasn't my strategy. It wasn't my designs. It wasn't my strength. You turned it around. David here is pointing to the obvious changes that God made in his life, that God effected in his life, similar to the changes that Isaiah attributed to the coming Messiah. Remember Isaiah 61? He's anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He's come to bring about the great reversal, to give me a party hat for this ashes, a garment of praise for the spirit of despair. Isaiah was pointing to Jesus. Jesus himself applied the text to himself in Luke 4. David here is pointing us to Jesus, to the fact that mourning becomes dancing. Praise comes out of silence when Jesus enters our circumstances. Not God's blessing, not God's help or strength, not God's different perspective, not God's change of mind He makes in us, but God Himself. He is the provision. Jesus is the provision that redeems our pain and suffering, even to the point that David says this in verse 12. That my glory. Now compare that with verse 6. David's glory was his prosperity and his false security that nothing would ever change because of who he was. Now in verse 12 he says, my glory is to sing your praises. My glory is to point people to you, not to set myself up as the example of blessing and prosperity that comes from God. My glory is to sing of your praise and not be silent. I'll give thanks to you forever. Here's the interesting thing, I think. David comes to the end of himself. And in a sense, the life that he thought he was living for God was in effect attributed to a silent witness. He might as well have been dead than to set himself up as the example that reflected God's goodness through his good works, through his prosperity. Yet when As a result of the pain and suffering that he endured, God enters his life and begins to set him ablaze with thanksgiving and praise and dancing. His life now, at the end of himself, recognizing how helpless he is, how needy of God he is, becomes a voice for God. His glory begins to sing praise. David's strength, David's position, David's success begins to point people to God. Because now he knows who he really is. Jesus redeems the pain and loss for his purposes, so that our glory may sing his praises. So in the end, only Jesus can keep us from wasting our lives in either pleasure or pain. At the end of the day, he's the answer. He's the only answer. The fact of the matter is, David did get some relief from his trial and tragedy, right? He sees that reversal. But more than his circumstances being changed, it was his life that was changed forever. He now lives a life of gratitude. Now not saying, I shall never be moved, but praise God for the things that he's brought into my life. I think with that he begins to know the temporary nature of prosperity. But he also begins to embrace God in both the good and bad, prosperity and pain. So the answer to the question is, what good can God bring into our loss, our trials, our pain? It's the same answer to the question of what good God can bring into any other part of our life. It's himself. Himself and him alone. It's really the truest, deepest desire of the human heart to know God. To know him in all of his goodness. You've heard it shared. We share it together. I read a story of a man named Christian Winan this last week in a book written by Drew Dick called Yawning at Tigers. Christian Winan was one of those guys who thought he was on the top of the world. He was a publisher of a prestigious publication of poetry, kind of at the top of his game. He was 39 years old. I mean, his mountain stood strong. Assuming he felt like he could never be moved. At 39, on his birthday, he was diagnosed with an incurable form of blood cancer. And so he wrote about his experience. He said, and I quote, "I have had bones die and bowels fail, joints lock in my face, on arms and legs, so that I couldn't eat, couldn't walk. I've passed through pain I could have never imagined, pain that seemed to incinerate all of my thoughts of God and leave me sitting there in the ashes alone." He was a young man who had known Christ early in his life, even as you hear John and Emily testify to this morning. Even though he had confessed Christ, he said that through his education, through college, that his faith had evaporated in a blast of modernism and secularism to which he was exposed in college. But he says that it was the pain and suffering of his cancer that brought him back to God. He wrote, "I'm a Christian because of that moment on the cross when Jesus, drinking the very dregs of human bitterness, cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The point is that God is with us, not beyond us in suffering. I'm a Christian because I understand that moment of Christ's passion to have meaning in my own life, and what it means is that absolute solitary and singular nature of extreme human pain is an illusion. I'm not suggesting that ministering angels are going to come down and comfort you as you desire. If I were to paraphrase, I'm not suggesting that God is going to bring relief to all of our pain. What I am suggesting, though, is this: that Christ's suffering shatters the iron walls around our individual human suffering. God is with us. At the end of the day, the message I hope we hear through our stories that we share is this: the exhortation, the admonition. Don't waste your life. Don't waste your trial. Don't waste your pain. Don't waste your cancer. Don't waste your blessing. Don't waste your success. Don't waste your life. Because far too many of us do. So how do I keep from wasting my life? It requires first a healthy and growing relationship with Jesus Christ. And listen, that doesn't mean being a nominal or congregational Christian. That doesn't mean walking through life with this assent to the truth about God. It means a personal, growing, intimate relationship with the living God, Jesus Christ. Apart from a growing personal relationship with Him, listen, friends, we'll waste it. We'll go through life seeking relief and not redemption of our pain. If you're here this morning and you don't know that God, you have never known a personal relationship with the God who went to the cross for you, then the invitation this morning is to come to Him. We'd love to introduce you to Him. If you don't know Jesus, you don't know this God who suffered on your behalf so that your suffering can mean something, I want to welcome you in just a few minutes. The worship team leads us in worship. You can come up here. I'd love to talk with you up here on the front pew. You can take your connection card, or you can just indicate you want to talk to somebody. But we'll get together and talk about that. But for those of us who name the name of Christ, those of us who are Christians, it's so easy to make the mistake of David, right? Say, here's my life, and I'm doing so well. I'll never be moved. Recognize the precarious nature of that and come back. Come back to Him. Come back into a growing relationship with Jesus. And you do that simply by just turning to Him wherever you're at. Man, it doesn't take anybody else. Jesus is our intercessor, our mediator before God. You can bow even as we worship and surrender. Just surrender. Reaffirm the Lordship of Christ in your life right where you're at. Or you can ask someone around you to pray with you, for you. I'd love to do that. Others would love to do that. But it begins there. And then it continues through a healthy, growing relationship with others. That's accountability. Right? It means engaging with others deeply in your life. Listen, and you know this. We talk about this all the time. Gathering on Sundays won't make that happen. We got to be personally responsible to lean in and build relationships with each other to the point that we're willing to open our lives and share like this. And then it demands honest, transparent sharing. Authenticity. No makeup. No fakes. Just open honesty about the difficulty of life, but the goodness of God that just melts that away.